Cool. Welcome back, scholars. Today we're putting the 14th century in perspective by mostly talking about Chaucer and what it was like during the time of Chaucer. Spoilers, he's your reading for this week. We're going to be reading excerpts from the Canterbury Tales, and Spark Notes won't help you. This lecture should, though. We're not going to be looking at the literature like we're in a literature class. We're in a humanities class. So what we're doing here is trying to both contextualize what we know about the time period and the environment and the context to better understand Chaucer's literature, but then also looking at the literature for the clues of what we can then understand about social commentary and values and what people were up to at the time. So kind of coming at it from both directions. You're looking at mostly commentary and sort of hints on what was important to a person during that time. Certainly it's what was important to Chaucer because he's telling these stories, but they were so popular, which means that they resonated. So let us pop on into this here PowerPoint presentation and rock out. Today is pretty much all about Geoffrey Chaucer. We'll talk a little bit about, just kidding, it's mostly Geoffrey. So next time, we're actually going to look at the art and the music of this era and that beginning of the transition from the late medieval into the early Renaissance, because that is where we're sitting right now at that very early transition period. As I browbeat you in last session, the medieval period is still a time of great innovation and achievement, but not necessarily in all aspects of culture and kind of in a pretty narrow zone, I suppose. Architectural feats were some of the greatest in mankind's existence on this planet to this day. There's still some of the most incredible achievements that we've made. So architecture, the Dark Ages weren't so dark. They're pretty amazing. Literature is changing. There's several great authors from this period who have left a legacy that's still very present in our modern culture 600 years later. We're looking at Chaucer. You will also notice in your Blackboard shell, you've got a couple videos on Dante. Though we're not going to read Dante because we've only got sort of a week. I've chosen Chaucer to focus on for our readings, but Dante is still important, and I think it's important for you to sort of earmark him and tag him as part of this period that we're talking about. So literature is changing. Architectural movements were incredible. We are focusing on the strengths of the medieval period right now, and how in the context of time, they did not see a lack in an area. Like painting and art, as we think of it today, just simply served different functions for them. So they were nailing it for what they needed. Art was, again, an adornment of architectural space. We've made huge we've made huge leaps and bounds in the technologies and stylistically for architecture. The paintings, the sculptures, they tended to service and decorate the architecture. Or adornment of words. We're making great progress now in literature and literacy, and you'll see art adorning words in illuminated manuscripts. So they're either part of a wall or part of a book. Not really a separate thing considered independently important beyond a means of embellishment. These ideas start to change, though, and that's what we're going to get into heavily next lecture. So that's another show. Stay tuned. Geoffrey Chaucer. Let's get to the man, the myth, some truths. Okay, so he lived and died in the 14th century. I mean, he died in 1400. So the very first year of the 15th century, he's a 14th century man, right? So we have had, up until this point, sort of the feudal system where we've separated the very wealthy from the laborers. So you've got landowners and you've got laborers. There wasn't really a middle class. There wasn't somebody who was wealthy but not sort of landed noble gentry peerage. The other sort of power dynamic that was built into that old system was, of course, the church. They had the money. They were commissioning these grandiose pieces of architecture and these paintings and these works of entertainment like Everyman. So we've got the church being sort of a major contender of influence, and though a bishop, a prioress, an abbess, a nun, a monk, a priest, they're not, say, wealthy, they don't own land, they don't have titles, but they have quite a lot of power and quite a lot of money. Or at least they represent a lot of power and a lot of money. So these are sort of the three classes that we had at that point. But work real hard and raise your station in life wasn't really a thing until we start getting this rise of the merchant class. And that is starting to kind of rock the old feudal social system quite a bit, because you've got these wealthy people who aren't knights and lords and landed gentry, and they didn't get chosen by the king. They've made their own way and may have their own opinions. And it really, really shakes up the social system. So Geoffrey Chaucer represents that because he was born the son of a wealthy wine merchant. Merchants were not valued. And so kind of a way to keep the middle class down, or this emerging sense of a middle class down, was this idea that a quest for wealth was not godly. So, like the work ethic of like, work hard, earn things, make something of yourself, keep your family, whatever. That was not the idea. That was not a concept during this period. So, social mobility was also not a concept of you can be anything you want to be, Timmy. No, you can't, Timmy. It's the 14th century. So, we've got this emerging middle class. They are earning their own money, which is starting to get them wealth, but not earning them any status or respect, because the church and the sort of landed feudal system lords are saying like, no, a quest for money's sake is very ungodly, very dirty, very unvirtuous. So it was a way to keep the wealthy from sort of gaining any power by sort of taking away their place in a social class system that would give them any sort of like virtue or standing or respectability. This, however, eventually erodes because the people with all the money are gonna eventually start getting a seat at the table for voting on how the system works. But it took a long time. And mostly it came from people like Geoffrey Chaucer, who his dad had zero respect because he was just, a merchant. He may have made a lot of money, but, it was dirty business money. So his son, however, could be educated very well because he could pay for that. He might get his son into military or governmental service and start gaining some of that virtue and being part of that upper class power structure through virtue of his dad's money. So gaining sort of a foothold in the old system of what it takes to have your name mean something through the virtue of being like on the back of that merchant class money. And that's pretty much what Chaucer and his family did for him. He served in the military on campaigns in France. He was a member of the parliament. He was an ambassador to Italy for the king. He also traveled to Spain. He set up tournaments for the king. He was like a royal coordinator of festivities, which, being a master of ceremonies, is a pretty intense job. We have some pay stubs for him, like basically annual tax bills. He made about £40 a year by the end of his career in government service. A laborer during that time made about 1 penny per day, and this is when 240 pennies equaled a pound. So Most people, most laborers didn't make more than about £1.50 per year, and he made 40. So he was doing quite well financially. He was certainly not part of the laboring class. So he is documented as a public servant. That was what he was if you asked him, even by the time he died. He was not a writer, as it were. And we don't actually have any of his surviving writing. Perhaps not even his signature, which is a bit odd because he worked for the government and you'd figure he would have had to red tape sign off for streamers and party supplies for those royal tournaments. But perhaps there's some waiting in some archive somewhere, just hoping for a historical research assistant to strike gold. Could it be you? Maybe it'll be me in my lovely retirement. But I'm trying to paint a picture of Chaucer being sort of upwardly mobile as far as status goes. He was certainly born to a wealthy family, but not of any kind of government position. His education and his public service to the crown meant that he was fluent in French, Italian, and Latin. He was a very well-educated man, and he was certainly not part of the everyman regular class folk. So why did he choose English for the tales? Well, he was a bit of an anthropologist, and I think you can really see that in the Canterbury Tales, that he was a social scientist. I think the classes and the various walks of life in his time period, in his lifetime, he was fascinated with what would happen if you chunked all those people together, because the crew of the Canterbury Tales, the Pilgrims, those people would never have interacted in any other situation. So he's kind of created this social experiment. Of course, it's fiction, but it's very much based on the reality of social class and probably personalities and real people that he knew in his life. And English was the way that he could illustrate a lot of the nuances there. We're going to have a talk about language and dialect and how to sort of give character through language here in a minute. But that's almost impossible to do, I guess I'll say right off the bat, in another language. And then certainly translating things are lost in translation because they become very specific to the region and period of the translator. I will say when I was in, I think, high school, I was reading one of the ancient Greek plays, Lysistrata, translated into English. And the English was kind of like British English. And then the Spartans, when they came on the scene, they sounded like Scottish. Like they had brogues and they called people lass and laddie. And it was like, what is going on? This is an ancient Greek play. Well, the translator was British. So his way of kind of making a barbarian class of warriors, not scholars, sound a bit like Derpy from the Hills was to give them a Scottish accent, because the biggest, like, I don't know, face-punching drunkards he could think of were the Scots. And then me sitting in North Dakota, like 100 years later, it didn't resonate the same with me. I mean, would an American translator have tried to make them, I don't know, Southern or something? You know, you add all of these layers of current social political nuance when you have to translate something that just doesn't give you the real picture of what the original was. So if Geoffrey had written this in, why am I calling him Geoffrey? We're not friends. If Chaucer had written this in Latin, he would not have been able to play with the use of language and the way people talk between the classes and their social systems and their regions. So this was more of I don't know, a snapshot anthropological field study in his imagination of a cross-section of the classes from across England. And it couldn't have been done in anything but English if that was his true goal. And it really feels like that was a big part of it for him. So back to him not really being a writer, even though he wrote a bit. So he has a poem called Truth. We've got about 20 copies of that from the century after his death. Canterbury Tales, we have about 80. Some of his works, we only have one. All are handwritten copies on vellum. And remember, last week we talked about how costly and labor intensive handwritten transcriptions on vellum leather parchment were. So it's not just the Bible anymore. We're copying poems and stories. And imagine the amount of labor and expense just go into the paper and the ink and the person who can write. Yes, of course, the sort of noble work of monks copying the Bible. And then once you get into the Canterbury Tales here, you've got somebody nobly copying in their finest handwriting fart jokes and swear words and funny tales that are, not fit for, like, I wouldn't want to watch a movie of the Canterbury Tales with my mother to this day. I mean, 600 years later, I'm still uncomfortable like talking about those or enjoying them in mixed company. I will because I'm your professor and I'm here for educational purposes, but like we're going to have to talk about swear words and fart jokes and stuff because it's high literature. And that is what makes Geoffrey Chaucer so cutting edge for his time. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Chaucer's language. Here's the 4 big, jargony, fantastic words I'm going to use. I mean, they're not jargon words, they're just specific words. But we're going to talk about these 4 things so that you can better understand just sort of how to approach talking about language. English was, and I would say super still is, but maybe not to the same extreme degree, a jumble of dialects. Like standard English did not exist then. We at least have a hope that there's standard English spellings and pronunciations. There's a mix of English in its various forms within the Canterbury Tales, plus French, plus Latin. He mixes all of the dialects. So you get like lower class regional dialects, but these are all filtered through an educated man. So what we've got here is Middle English. Old English was sort of the 5th and 6th centuries, written down in the 7th century, but not very much. So we had Old English in the single digit centuries, and then 1066, so the middle of the 11th century, we have the Norman Conquest. And you've got a little documentary that's going to go over a bit of this era for you, so I'm not going to get into huge detail, but a big thing to recognize is English started to get a foothold. It was starting to get written down in Old English. And then Norman Conquest. And the Normans were Normandy is Northman land, but it's the northern coast of France. So they're, genetically Vikings and French folks. And William the Conqueror was not the heir to the French crown, but one of the later sons who didn't have his own stuff to do, so he went and made his own country by conquering England. So the Norman Conquest, the Normans invaded, the French invaded. English was outlawed for at least one generation. A little bit more than that, but think about if English was outlawed now for, say, the next 50 years and you weren't allowed to teach your kids that, or if they were going to be educated enough to write and read, that would definitely be something you wouldn't let them have or do. However, if you're a peasant who can't read and write anyway, who's going to bother to come teach you French? Nobody. So English gets lost for at least one generation in its written form, and it loses a lot of that momentum on becoming a language that gets written down. But during this period, especially with that heavy Norman French influence and legally, heavy Norman French oppression, if you will, the vowels and the pronunciation and grammar completely change in English, in Anglo. And it moves towards a classical European language in sound and look. Obviously, English never becomes a Romance language, but it's more recognizable as such after this period. So about 1,000 years ago, we had to sort of shuffle on to look a bit more parallel to the languages happening in Europe. 1360, so 300 years after the Normans outlawed English, that was the first time Parliament was addressed in English in those 300 years, which is insane. So to say that it was only like, ooh, one generation, we missed it. No, it was actually hundreds of years of really forcing down the English language as an official language, a written language, something that you could have proper business done in, government records legible in. You just didn't do that. In 1360, that Parliament address happened in English, but it's written in French. And it just says someone stood up and spoke English, and here's what they said, but all of that is written in French. So it got translated into French in the English Parliament when it was written to the records. So Chaucer is the work that starts to shape written English in this new period, this Middle English period. He uses certain words as English for the first time that we've ever seen it written down. But again, now we've kind of got this black box period where English is clearly still being used, because it's not like William the Conqueror took over England in 1066 and then was like, great, let's have 500,000 French tutors just go out in the countryside and teach farmers French. No, they didn't. They didn't care. It's just you couldn't write anything down in English that was going to be official or useful. And certainly in the education systems, it switched to French or Latin exclusively. But there's a lot of poor, illiterate people who've never owned a piece of certified paperwork in their lives, so that didn't really affect them much. So it carries on amongst the peasantry. They probably ended up having to learn more French, bled in over the generations, because their lords and their landowners may have been native French and never spoke a word of English, which several English kings after the conquest never learned a word of English. They never spoke English at all, because, like, why would they? Gross, right? So it became one of those, like, gross peasant things again. After it had gained some traction by the 10th century, off it went. But that bleed in, where English is alive and well in the lowest classes, they're still picking up and hearing other words, certainly French words, Norman language being spoken around them. They probably had to answer to commands in French and instructions in French, and then they could complain about it in English with their friends and neighbors. So English went a bit underground, I suppose, during this time. And Chaucer bringing it up as something that gets written down as an actual work of literature was a huge leap, again, out of this sort of black boxed few centuries where English still existed, but it was changing, and it was changing quite rapidly. All right, so Lexis, or the lexicon, if you will. Lexis, it means vocabulary. So again, using certain words in English for the first time is when you add a word to the lexicon. So it's changing the lexis. He's adding words that might have been originally French, but you just use them in English now. So French words and Latin words tended to bleed into use in English. So the lexis for court and governmental issues, architectural terms, because again, architects had to be very good at math. They had to be able to read books. Those books were probably written in Latin. Cuisine, law, legal proceedings, and of course the church. So none of these would have been operating in English for 3 centuries. And so English then starts to adopt the words in use for those things. There's going to be a lot more French and Latin heavy language there, vocabulary. So think about one syllable English words. So those pretty much stay, like God, man, head, heart, nose, ear, foot, knee, earth, sky. These stay in the language, but polysyllabic French words and Latin words, um, intellectual, cuisine, organization, administration, politics, ecclesiastics. These are all words that we use to describe those functions, but those are all foreign words that got brought into the English vocabulary. And there's still very much a class divide between what English words stayed and what got sort of adapted into French and Latin. So the peasants, they spoke English and they raised the animals on the farms, right? So we still call them cow, sow, deer, lamb, goose, duck. These are English words. They haven't changed in 600 years. Aristocrats, however, ate the food. So the cuisine words for the animal, the cow, once it's dead and cooked and served on a plate, is now beef. And beef is French. You've got a deer and you've got venison. Venison is a French word, but that's what a deer is once it's cooked and served to rich people. So mutton, veal, pork, these are all European, French, and Latinate words that bleed in because the aristocracy doesn't speak English, and they're the ones talking about the food on their plate, whereas the peasants speak English, and they're talking about the living animals. So there is still, to this day, and part of my sort of thesis statement on there's no such thing as a synonym. Your choice between an Anglo or Anglo-Saxon word versus a Latin-based or French synonym color the meaning and tell your reader some context for either the character in fiction or certainly in politics if you're trying to sound fancy and educated and an authority or an expert on something, you would switch to the Latin French words. If you're trying to appeal to just, Joe Sixpack, if that's what Sarah Palin said all those years ago, just some guy, and be like, see, I'm just like you. I'm one of the people. Vote for me. I understand you. I'll help you out. Then you try to very carefully choose Anglo-Saxon words because those are the words of the people. They always have been for centuries. If you read any speeches by Abraham Lincoln, including the Gettysburg Address, you will see that it is mostly Anglo words. He had choices where he could have made more Latin or French options, but he chooses not to because he's trying to, quote, speak plainly, but also make people feel like he's just one of the guys. So your choice in a synonym, it's not a synonym. It's got different connotations to it. And choosing from your pile of English words and your pile of European, French, Norman conquest invasion words are a class statement, really, still, which is still a political statement. Right, so next word, morphology. That is the form or shape of the language. And it goes along with word choice. So how can you find some roots? Well, there's weak verbs versus strong verbs. And that is changes the form of the word to change the meaning rather than just adding an ending. So English, you've got these strong verbs where, you run or you ran, you drink or you drank or you were drunk, you win or yesterday you won, I am, we are, it is, we were, it was. So when the whole word changes or the middle of the word changes, those are pretty much always going to be your English words. Weak verbs, again, did we name these because of our political statements on English is better? I don't know. I guess if it's talking about English vocabulary, you get to take that stance. The new verbs coming from foreign languages are almost always weak verbs in that you just change the ending. So like the word change, it was changed. Televised, believe, believed. So anything that you just add an ed or an ing to the end of, that's a weak verb. Those are almost always foreign, not original English. So Chaucer uses the strong verb form for certain words, which was still an option then, because remember, we didn't have standardized spelling, which may be much to your chagrin last week with Everyman. And, I gave you side by side modern and original for the Chaucer. So, you're welcome, I guess. But bother to read the original because it's cool. And he makes choices that matter that you can't make anymore in our sort of standardized English, like help me. We've taken this English word and we've Frenchified it by making it a weak verb. So now you're helping someone or you helped them yesterday. Chaucer keeps it strong and says instead of helped, it's holpen. So he changes it to Holpen. So holpen instead of helping. So these older versions of words in certain situations color the character he's talking about and emphasize a particular point. So, yes, morphology being the shape or the form of the language. I think that goes along with the choice of lexis, that word choice. Finally, phonology, the sound of words, phono, sound. Pronounce everything. So I'm not going to make you do this for all of the Chaucer, but let's say the first 25 lines of the prologue. Look at the Old English and just say it out loud. If you have to do it in the car because you're home with your family and they're listening and they think you're weird, or maybe, sit there and give them a performance. So there are no silent letters. It will really help when you see the documentary on the Adventure of English. They read some Middle English out loud for you, and it's great. I am not a professional at Middle English, but English is still written phonetically at this point. So there aren't any silent letters like bloody French. So it's not knight, but knigished. So, a knight in shining armor is a knigished in shining armor, right? So think a, e, I, o, u, not a, e, I, o, u. Okay, so make the noises, not the letters. So in the prologue, you also notice that he bounces French and English words against each other, which give it a feeling of Old English and Scandinavian poetry. And poetry was not rhyming as in the last line of each line sounds like the previous. We didn't do rhyming schemes like that. It was an assonance and alliteration that was used throughout. So assonance, the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. So you got that. That's a famous one from modern times, My Fair Lady. But that one is the same vowel sound repeated throughout. So that's why it's important, because if you're just reading it, you might not be catching that the noises are actually the same. Because, rain and Spain are spelled the same, mainly on the plain, versus alliteration is the consonant or the initial sounds repeating. So Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's the initial sound repeating throughout, or consonant or hard sounds. So the alliteration makes you slow down. I mean, look at us with our tongue twisters of being like, how fast can you say Peter Piper picked? You can't, right? There's a limit to how fast you can say something in alliteration because you get tongue-tied. So it makes you slow down. So that's a way that he could get you to slow down and read at a stately pace and kind of take in what he's having to say. Finally, syntax, and that's arrangement of words. Grammar structure had not been firmly established by the time Chaucer wrote this, so you can move the word order around a lot more. Do you know or do you want questions? This comes hundreds of years later. Shakespeare starts using this regularly. So Middle English, you go home. Statement, go you home. Question. Construe thou clearly. That's a demand, get this. So cumulative comparisons. These are great because Nowadays, in modern English, you can't do double negatives, right? When somebody says, I didn't see nothing, it's like, oh, so you did see something, because double negatives cancel out. They just compound in Chaucer's English. And so the most unkindest cut of all is a buildup of more. I love the multiple negative because it's building it up negative. They still use it in Italian. I don't speak French. Maybe they do use it in French. I don't know. But you can kind of build up the negative by adding as many negative words as possible. And I love one of the great ones that he has about, I think, the knight or the Knicht, um, where he says, he never yet in no way said nothing bad about nobody. We got a quadruple negative in there to be like, he's a real nice guy. It's just a great, loose, fun use of the language that now that it's been sort of structured much more rigidly, we can't play with it like Chaucer could. But you know what? A lot of our structure and a lot of our communication use was influenced by what Chaucer did as he played with the variety of language here. So beyond just the cool words he used and the fact that it's in English, it is still super important. Let's get into gender roles. Again, so if you tried to spark notes this biz, because like I did a couple years ago and I was like, wow, this doesn't help with anything, does it? It doesn't really dig deep into those hints of what people just talk about flippantly or what's cool or what's fine. And I think something that the plague has brought out. Oh, I have a sheet that I'm going to put up on the shell. I found something nifty for you, but the plague changed a lot of social, personal relationships. So something about gender roles. We can come back into questioning these things and exploring them because, again, the plague changed society and culture pretty quick. Because let's say, just to start with, you don't get married because you're like, I want to grow old together. And don't worry about it. We can do that later. We've got 50, 60, 70 years together. This is going to be great. Or let's not get married till we're 40 because, we both need to build up our 401ks and blah, 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 blah. And then we'll see who's making more money before you couldn't plan that far in the future because plague. Because, well, this summer when the mosquitoes get funny and the rats and the fleas get hungry, you might die. 50-50 chance you're probably going to die. Oh, all I want to be is a mother. Well, I might have 7 or 8 kids, but 50-50 chance any of them will make it. Your whole idea of like what the point of life is and what relationships look like and what you pin your hopes and dreams on really has to adjust quite quickly to situations like that. You have to kind of change what the meaning of life is. So these questions about desire, is it different for a man versus a woman? A man with desire is healthy. A woman with desire is deviant, right? But a man of the cloth is also a deviant if he's lustful. So what is that relationship between desire and holiness? Remember, we're still very much under a heavy church influence at this time. I hope I drove that home in the 3 hours of last week. But we're pretty much in like one monolithic single view of right and wrong, good and evil during this period. And we're going to see that start to fall apart. Certainly we're seeing that with just even that rise of the middle-class merchants kind of shaking up the really rigid structure of how the world works. But things like plague causing ideas about gender roles and relationships and sex having to get restructured again. We have to ask these questions now. Marriage, where we see the world of late medieval times, he shows the nitty and the gritty and the unpretty. He shows all of the dysfunction between two people in marriage. It's like very reality TV life stuff. Um, I will also say that Geoffrey Chaucer is a dude. So he may write women, and it's like, yes, the wife of Bath. She's one of the first. She's not real, and she was written by a dude. So some of it is edgy, and some of it is like, could be read through a feminist lens in that sense. But also remember that a guy wrote it, so it's what a guy thinks a girl would say about a guy. I know, take a minute, unpack that. But that whole idea of what is gender roles and normality and the real sense of desire and things. This is all still getting filtered just through Geoffrey Chaucer's idea of how the world works. Mind you, it's a very colorful and nuanced idea of how the world works. Like, he does a great job, but he's still just a guy, one guy. A good one, but, you know, he didn't, I don't think, ask. No, I can promise. He didn't, like, go find the wife of Bath and say, like, could you write me your memoirs? Thanks very much. No, he made her up. And he made up what she thinks and what she says. So, what he thinks happens in marriages between classes and things could be some of his prejudices about particular social classes and things as well. So keep that in mind. I don't think that he was totally off base from reality, but some of his ugliest commentary may be more about his own problems than that of other social problems. Or they might not be, but always keeping in mind that we sort of have that unreliable narrator concern as we're looking at this, because it's not documentary fact, right? It's fiction. But it still does give us a lot of layers of insight on like what was important and what's getting brought up even to talk about. So, gender roles, let me just talk about these two paintings here quick. In our modern eyes, so an old dude with a really young girl, that's, I think, getting grosser in modern culture, but that's not something that's like new and shocking, like everybody's seen it, right? I can't remember the Playboy bunny who married that like 92-year-old guy. That was a big thing when I was young. I think probably doesn't resonate with you anymore, but the idea of like sugar daddies or something like that. Like, we've got these older men with very young girls. It's kind of a status symbol for his money, or, you know, a status symbol for her beauty, that kind of just still exists in culture, where it seems, whether or not you have an opinion on it, it still is somewhat normalized. Whereas if you look at the image on the right, with the very young man and the old lady, we just don't see that in our modern culture. Like, does that one weird you out more than the other one? Do they both weird you out, but you're more culturally like conditioned to think that old dude is fine, old lady is weird? Why is one of them more okay than the other? It shouldn't be, but it is, right? Society and culture and perceptions like don't always have to make logical sense. We just get conditioned this way because that's the way it is, right? An interesting note about the plague. I know, I'm just going to keep bringing up things because you don't talk about the plague when you're writing about the plague. So we've got to talk about what you're not hearing about the plague in the plague literature. Men died. Shocker. If a woman was sat at home on the farm and her husband died and her sons died and everybody's brothers died, and so all of a sudden she sat there as a widow and there's land, you know, even if she's just a tenant feudal farmer that she's responsible for these 3 acres, that's still an opportunity for someone to be working the land and having a place in the system. So even amongst the peasants, like having a hut with a couple acres that you're supposed to be doing for the Lord is still a couple acres you can be doing for the Lord and keeping a percentage of. So it's a pretty sweet deal as far as peasant options go. So old lady, if she dies, it goes up for anybody, Russian roulette, whatever the Lord decides, right? So if she still wants to have any control over what happens, or certainly if she wants to live there, she can't if she shows up for next tax year without the crops, without her payment. So what does she do? She marries a younger man. Whether or not anybody thought that they would get kids out of the arrangement, probably not. Maybe sometimes. But getting a young man who could work the land, and if you marry him, he's then entitled to inherit it as his staked claim, became hugely more common practice during the plague era because the situation arose where we're having to create more relationships for reasons that maybe didn't exist before in the same quantity or urgency as they did in this new situation of bananas, half the people died, right? And it's not going to be a 50-50 split of who. So you end up with widows with concerns. So you marry a teenage boy so that he's got something to do when he's 20 and you're dead. Great. The neighbor boy from down the street, he seemed like a nice boy, deserves an opportunity. Or maybe things did get kinky. I don't know. But we certainly know from marriage registers that young men were marrying much older women at a rate never before seen during this period of the plague, starting in the 14th century, because needs must. So it creates these new ideas of what's right and what's wrong and what's gross and what's creepy and what's fine. And what marriage really means, especially when it's usually like marriage means making babies. And so old men get young girls because young girls can make babies. And now that's not the priority of this other kind of marriage that we're seeing depicted on the right. So that shakes things up again. And identity is something that this also shakes up. Like, what does it mean to have an identity beyond being a woman and having these virtues, or being a man and having these accomplishments, right? Like in this old school sugar daddy, sugar baby situation on the left, like her job is to be pretty and probably eventually pregnant. His job is to be wealthy and have titles and lands and money. Are they more than just that? I'm sure both of them wish they could be, or hoped that someone would recognize that. Or maybe they don't, but does it even exist? So these are things that all kind of got shaken up during this period, and Chaucer dares to address it. Another big thing that comes up in a lot of the stories is rape. And rape, the definition changes over time, and there are cultural connotations. So reading into these portrayals and depictions, having to understand what it actually meant for that society. And then you can add on the layers of what it means for us hundreds of years later. But, we're not the same culture. We may vaguely speak the same language and that we can kind of recognize it, and it may be our ancestral culture, but that's not where we are in society anymore. And it's kind of interesting, I think, to maybe understand a more nuanced how we got here by understanding where we came from in a lot of these cultural situations. And rape is one thing that he covers a lot that looks bizarre to us. Like, for example, in the 14th century, can you rape a prostitute? No. So rape is looked at under the microscope of the virtues of the woman in question. So that whole, like, was she asking for it, or, well, she's kind of a hoe, means like, no problem, right? I mean, we see that in certain countries now where women who come forward as rape victims get imprisoned for having premarital sex, right? Just culturally, like what that means, whether or not it's a violation and victimhood, even though it seems so obvious, isn't culturally obvious in certain places and times. And this is one of those times where, yes, rape is bad, but only for a woman whose virtue, virginity, chastity is important. And important to whom? We're going to say creepy old men on the left. Like, that girl's got to be a virgin and she's got to be pretty. So raping her means that, like, an economic commodity got stolen. And I know that that's gross and wrong, but that was the framing of it at this time. So I guess understanding it that way. And the wife of Bath, she just casually starts her story with a knight raping a maiden. Just, as you do, like fell off his horse on top of her, whoopsie daisy. It's not, it's, and the fact that knights at this time, kniggets, I can't do it. Anyway, were told explicitly not to rape women. Like that was one of the rules, as if it had to be stated. But what kind of women can't you rape? The Wife of Bath tells a tale of rape by a knight in her story, and frankly, it like wasn't that big of a deal. He got in trouble, but like, did he? Let's talk a little bit about Chaucer, because again, this is a man writing stories that are supposed to be told by women about women's violence, but it's still a dude writing it. So there's a lot of layers there. He, by the way, got accused by one Cecily Champagne, who was a noble lady, a minor noble lady. There's a legal document that releases Geoffrey Chaucer from the charge of raptus. Raptus, of course, all of this was written in Latin. We didn't have English in the legal system at this time. So it's a document in Latin, and Cecily Champagne releases Geoffrey Chaucer from the charge of, quote, raptus. And raptus in Latin can mean rape, it can mean abduction, or it can mean any list of forms of violence against a woman, not necessarily sexual. So he could have slapped her. He could have drug her into his carriage for a nice long conversation once. We have no idea what happened there, but he was accused of something that may or may not have been rape. Maybe not. Probably not. I mean, but also maybe. So again, unreliable narrator for taking his views on this particular issue as just universal global fact of how 14th century English people felt about this particular issue. But certainly the ways that he handles it can definitely give us a peek into the complexity in which these issues were taken up during that time. Another somewhat edgy thing that he does deal with, but in that very 14th century way. I'm just trying to prepare you for reading this and not getting either totally horrified, grossed out, or just very confused. You're going to be horrified and grossed out, but like, let's have it be for the correct reasons, right? Or at least reasons that you're better understanding the text. I guess all of the reasons are correct reasons, but anyway, we're still contextualizing. So social other. In Europe at this time, Muslims, Jews, and Christians did live side by side in many, many cities across Europe. However, Jews had been expelled from England. So the Normans did some racial and religious oppression, and they kicked out the Jews. So they either had to go into hiding or they literally had to leave the country, probably not with any of their wealth or property. So they were alien to English people. So in this heavily Christian religious island, like literally an island cut off from mainland Europe, most people had never met a Jewish person. The Squire's Tale takes place in Mongolia. So he talks about Muslims there, and it's kind of this exotic land that no other character in his tale probably would have known about, except maybe the knight. The prioress, she tells like a super racist story about Jews, which of course, like she would have never met one in her life. But it just kind of gives a hint possibly at her class level, or certainly her religious place as a prioress in the Catholic Church, that she had some preconceived racisms and bigotries built into her worldview during this time. The pardoner, they make a lot of references to the pardoner as being either a gelding, which is a horse that you cut the testicles off of, so like basically calling him a eunuch, or a mare, which is a lady horse, so that would be he's homosexual. So they're basically attacking his manliness, Because he doesn't have a beard and he seems rather effeminate, and they also don't like him for a lot of other reasons. So it's kind of one of those ad hominem attacks where you don't like him for X reasons, so you're going to throw Y at him. Be like, yeah, well, um, so homosexuality is an othering social stigma as well. And certainly with the partner, we've got those accusations being thrown around. Maybe because they didn't like him for other reasons, so they just tacked that one on as well. Or maybe the fact that he like couldn't grow a beard means that like you got personally attacked for being slightly metrosexual looking at that time. And again, presentation and dress and how you show yourself to the world meant a lot back then because it wasn't a form of social expression. It was a form of basically like it was your name tag for where you are in the societal structure. So it wasn't about you being an individual. It was about showing people how to talk to you, how not to talk to you, who you are in that social space. So looking different was a problem. And that includes just dressing different, dressing wrong for your class. There are actually laws about it. You could get sent to prison for wearing the wrong kind of dress or collar or lapel or hat, or not wearing a hat sometimes. Also get you thrown in prison. So social structure was very strict and stringent and hard. And so social othering happened in a way that I think you might even have a hard time wrapping your mind around now. All right, and finally, plague. 14th century, killed anywhere between 25 or 75 or 200 million people in Europe during the 14th century. Anywhere between 30 and 60% of the population died. So there was a great plague of like 1346 to 50, I don't know, some people would say 53, some people say 56. There was basically plague every year for almost 100 years. There was a solid 60 years of plague from 1340 to 1400. It comes in the summer and the fall. I mean, we all know what flu season is these days. I mean, whatever, COVID kind of hit us in the spring. But anyway, I think we get plague a little bit more than I've ever experienced students getting plague when I've had to give this lecture. I haven't taught this in a few years, and I might just be repeating myself for stuff you've already experienced. But the bubonic plague is the Greek term for your lymph node is a bubos. And so that is like, you know, the thing that gets swollen up in your neck, like right under your jaw. And you have lymphs in your groin, sort of right at where your legs meet on the inside, in your armpits. So those would swell up and your skin would turn black as the disease spreads. So the lymph nodes like on your neck, you would get a ring around your rosy and that you'd sort of start getting these like black chin strap of dead blood bleeding out into your skin tissues. The nose and the lymphs would start to turn color. Infection would start to set in, of course, as that blood stays stagnant in your tissues where it's not supposed to be. Chills, muscle cramps, seizures, vomiting blood. Humans would die in like 2 to 5 days. So you'd be fine on Friday, dead by Monday kind of situation. The first plague of Justinian was during the Roman period, and 542, I think. Man, I should Google these things first. I'm pretty sure about 542. All right, 50 million dead. That was 800 years earlier, and people had mostly forgotten about it, or at least it sounded like a really dramatic mythic tale. And I think that's what the Black Plague is to us now. It's been sort of a little more than 500 years, and we think that they were exaggerating. That's why the 200 million people went to 75 million people, and then it was like, oh no, it was like 25 million people, and then it's back up to like 75 million people as more research is done. Again, we just didn't keep really good books about people globally, so it's got to always be an estimate. Um, so maybe it was as bad as they say. So, second plague is the one that we're talking about during Chaucer's lifetime. 1340 to 1400 um, was Chaucer's entire lifetime, and it also happened to be the plague zone. He lived during the plague era. It is not an extreme focus in his work, but it's always in the back. So it's either like, again, you totally don't even realize how messed up your life is. Or it's just so understood that, of course, it's there. Obviously, it's 1362. Yeah, plague. Duh. So it is addressed in how people react. So people's actions sort of branched into two extremes. You've got fear and devotion to the church. Um, this aspect of 14th century culture has a lot to do with fear and the plague and delicacy of human life. Is plague a punishment from God? A lot of that, like, what is the meaning of life now that everything that I thought was isn't, coming back to the church. And then you've got that sort of screw it, let's party attitude on the other end. So, plague doctors, that costume that you see here in this image is the bird mask. The beak held flowers and incense to keep the bad smells, which were thought to be miasmas and bad humors, away. The rest of the suit is either leather or waxed wool. No one had any idea how this thing spread, like bad air, humors, bad smells, God's wrath, whatever. We know that it was almost certainly fleas that lived on rats that bit people that transmitted the disease through their saliva. Um, so the costume here, the plague costume, actually turns out that it was highly effective because fleas could not bite the doctors. They were protected on their skin from the air was their purpose, but it also worked against biting insects. Also, the herbs used for good smells in the mass were natural insecticides and anti-infection medicines. So lucky guess on their part, but well done. All right, so let's get back a little bit to the economy, which I kind of hinted at with old ladies marrying younger fellas for economic reasons and logistics rather than love and romance. Some cities lost 2/3 of their population. So people just simply didn't exist to do the jobs. And after the plague, peasants were like in demand. You didn't have enough peasants to work your land. So it used to be peasants were just like, they came with the property, like, ants or something. And now, like, laborers became a job as opposed to just, things that already existed and grew up like daisies. So wages increased for laborers. Labor was hard to find. It was the first time there was actually a demand for peasants in history. Labor was a skill and a job now, not just an automatic position of serfdom because somebody was born on your property and you own them and they do stuff. The economy sort of collapses in a big way, but it's a completely new supply and demand situation and the building of a completely new economic principle as a result of just not enough people to go around to do the things the way that we've always done it. All right. So in conclusion, with the horrors of 60 years, more than a lifetime of plague, culture changes. The idea of an individual as important, an intellect, art, philosophy that we see in like the classical Roman era and things is almost non-existent by the 14th century. Because you can't rely on a single person. They're probably going to die, right? That really messes with your ability to plan and probably trust issues. So great minds like Chaucer and Dante were far more valued after the fact, like after they died, since their work survived and inspired. They didn't really enjoy fame and fandom during their lifetimes for their work. Instead, the fragility of human life and either the ever-presence of death as such a part of the culture in daily life was overshadowing this value of an individual. So fragility of death, or of human life, the sorts of passions and feelings that you can feel in a day became far more important than this whole like, we'll grow to love each other over a lifetime. Nah, lifetime is from now till next Tuesday. So passions, extreme emotions like highs and lows, agony, ecstasy are far more valued now culturally because they were attainable. So you see sort of this idea of like the passion of like meeting someone and knowing that you're totally in love with them because you saw them for 30 seconds and they looked at you. Woo! That becomes way more important than this sort of building a lifetime and raising kids together kind of love. You can see Dante, he literally goes to hell in the afterlife to chase his beloved Beatrice, which was a girl that he walked by in the market a few times and thought was real hot. He was madly stupid in love with him and literally like threw himself down into the fiery depths of hell to see her again. And so she died of the plague, spoilers. So this idea of like passion and romantic love, it can endure the plague because, you know, like heartache is part of the process. Things become intense, and intense emotions that you can feel in a brief time are better. It's like that, or more focused on here, because it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all, blah, blah, you know. All right, so in Chaucer, you see relations between a man and a woman as more central than, say, a love for one's child or a love for your parents because they're probably dead. It was common, like, not to name your kids for the first hot minute or even couple years because they're probably going to die anyway. Your parents weren't the most important thing in the world to you because they probably didn't live to see you to adulthood. So what do you have? You have God, the church. And if you're lucky, perhaps you have a fleeting, passionate romance. Such sources of joy cut off from existence, the meaning of our life on this planet being so unclear in its fragility, then walk into a Gothic cathedral again and feel just that awe-inspiring space that feels like it's never going anywhere. In all of this chaos and uncertainty, you've got the most certain thing on earth is just this edifice to heaven. So you can see why these cathedrals had such an important role in, again, that emotional experience that became such a central part of life and the meaning of it during this time. So saving one's soul, fear of hell, uncertainty of the afterlife, so you better be good because all we got on this earth is a rotten handful of years. So let's just shoot for the next life, was making the church a very important part of life for everyone. And it gave hope that after death there was a better place. And so it kept people on a path of good deeds. Because as you know, like if it's the apocalypse, we're all going to die tomorrow, like people start smashing in windows and stealing televisions and stuff, right? How do you keep the mayhem of live every day like it's your last, oh my God, we're all going to die, from absolutely being how everybody lives during 60 or 100 years of plague? A heavy attention to good deeds now equals eternal happiness and freedom, right? I see also the literature of the time, the lack of personal relationships like parents, children, being fulfilled by the devotion to the church and to prayer. It helped fill those emotional voids in people's existence, especially after something like a major loss. All right, let's close that up. That was a lot. I hope that helps you watch the other documentaries and read the excerpts from Chaucer this week. And we'll be getting more into the art and the other, like, meanwhile in the rest of the world while Chaucer was doing this, blah, 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 next week. Have a good one.